Hey guys, tonight we step into a world where a single strip of cloth could decide your entire reputation. You're walking through a medieval town, the streets muddy, the air filled with the smell of wood smoke and livestock, and suddenly you notice the women faces shadowed by long veils, heads tightly wrapped, eyes downcast, as though even glancing upward might invite scandal. It wasn't fashion, not really. It was control disguised as piety. You probably won't survive this, but we're going to try. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The medieval veil was far more than a light fabric flapping in the wind. To you here and now, it might look like a modest head covering a style choice, or maybe something you'd see in a Renaissance fair costume aisle. But back then, its meaning ran deep into the marrow of society, covering a woman's hair, or sometimes even her entire face, was as much about morality as it was about identity. To be uncovered in public, especially if you were married, was like walking into a modern office meeting wearing pajamas. Everyone noticed. Everyone judged. The rules were strict. Married women were expected to keep their heads covered as a sign of modesty and loyalty. Veils, wimples, hoods, and heavy cloths. These weren't mere accessories. They were badges of status and control. A veil could mean the difference between being seen as respectable or being branded scandalous. If you dared to walk bareheaded in the street, whispers followed you like gnats on a summer evening. It was the medieval version of being subtweeted by the whole village. For peasants, the veil was usually plain wool or linen, practical and rough. For wealthier women, it became a layered construction project. Veils stacked with circlets, pinned with intricate brooches, sometimes starched to impossible angles that could make a modern wedding planner cry with envy. It wasn't just cover your head. It was cover your head and make it look like an architectural marvel while you're at it. Imagine walking through a windy marketplace with what feels like a miniature tent strapped to your skull. One gust, and you're fighting fabric like a kite caught in a storm. The veil became a cultural leash. Male authority, whether fathers, husbands, priests, or magistrates, used it as a way to declare, "This woman belongs within boundaries." To you, it might feel like a scarf. To her, it was a signpost of obedience. Refusing to wear one could mark you as rebellious, indecent, or worse, available. And in a society where women were already seen as fragile keepers of family honor, being available meant exposure to gossip, punishment, and sometimes even legal trouble. Let's not sugarcoat it. The medieval church backed this practice hard. Religious sermons equated veiled heads with pure hearts. Paul's letters from the Bible were quoted endlessly. If a woman didn't cover her head, she dishonored her husband. To live bareheaded was not just breaking fashion etiquette, it was sin. And sin, as every priest reminded the congregation, could spread like mold on damp bread. Now picture the sensory side. Imagine the heat of summer when sweat trickled down your neck and the wool clung to your skin like an itchy reminder of subjugation. The smell wasn't flattering either. Fabric washed, rarely soaked with smoke from hearth fires, and the musk of daily labor would hang heavy around your face. You could taste the fibers when you spoke. Winter offered no relief. The veil grew damp from breath, stiff with frost freezing against your cheeks as you trudge through snow. Each season turned this so-called symbol of virtue into a damp, itchy cage. It's like the medieval equivalent of being told to wear a hoodie indoors at all times, except instead of looking cool, you're supposed to look submissive. And yes, people absolutely policed each other. Neighbors, clergy, relatives, all waiting to pounce on the slightest slip. Picture walking out of your house bareheaded, and immediately it's like you posted something controversial online. The comments roll in unsolicited, judgmental, endless. Medieval women endured that scrutiny every day. Sometimes veils became absurd in size. There are accounts of wimples so elaborate they made it difficult to eat or turn your head. Imagine trying to sip broth with a stiff linen tower wrapped around your chin. It's the 14th century version of drinking coffee while wearing one of those giant foam Halloween costumes. You look hilarious. You feel ridiculous. But heaven forbid you take it off. And here's a dark twist: punishment could follow if you were caught without one. In some towns, married women walking bareheaded were fined. Records tell us that in certain German cities, women had their hair chopped off publicly as a humiliating warning. The logic was vicious. If your head wasn't properly veiled, the community would veil you with shame. It was a punishment harsher than some property crimes. Think of it as the medieval justice system's version of deleting your social profile pictures in front of the whole town. But not every veil was purely repressive. There were women who learned to manipulate the rules. Some used extravagant veils to flaunt wealth, weaving gold thread or draping layers so wide they forced people to notice. In courts, a veil could become a weapon of subtle politics, its very fabric screaming, "I am untouchable." Others used veils for privacy, to hide pregnancies, illnesses, or simply their own thoughts behind a curtain of cloth. Still, the balance leaned heavily toward control. The veil reinforced the idea that a woman's body, and even her hair, belonged to someone else. A veil was less about protecting women and more about protecting male honor. You might think, why not just refuse? But refusal often came with risks that could end livelihoods or reputations. Freedom for many was traded for survival. If you compare it to today, it's like being forced to wear a badge that tracks your every move and signals your marital status to strangers. Imagine that badge itching your forehead every time you sweat, smelling like smoke and tangling in your soup. That was the veil, both suffocating and inescapable. You sitting here tonight can choose whether or not to wear a hat. For medieval women, that choice didn't exist. The veil was stitched into the fabric of life, binding women not just in cloth, but in expectations. Some historians think this was common. Others call it pure myth. But whether fact or folklore in specific details, the cultural pressure was undeniably real. And so, as you picture those narrow streets, the low-roofed houses, and the quiet figures moving with veils pressed close around their faces, you see how a simple piece of fabric became a silent weapon. Not of comfort, not of modesty, but of power. The veil whispers of obedience, of surveillance, of invisible chains that shaped entire lives. The story doesn't end with veils, of course. Tonight we're only at the beginning. From head coverings, we'll soon move into marriages that arrived too soon, dowries that transformed women into currency, and childhood stolen before they even had a chance to unfold. And that, my friend, is where our next chapter begins. You're 12 years old, and instead of worrying about dolls' games or sneaking honey cakes from the kitchen, you're handed a husband. Not a crush from down the street, not some farm boy with an awkward smile, but often a man twice or three times your age. In medieval times, marriage at 12 wasn't shocking, it was expected. Childhood ended faster than a loaf of bread left out in winter, and your new life began under a contract written by men who would never carry its weight. Picture it, the narrow, timber-framed houses, the village gossip winding through the air like chimney smoke, and there you are, barely tall enough to draw water from a well dressed in a makeshift bridal gown. Your veil isn't about modesty anymore. It's a flag of transfer proof that you've been moved from one household's ledger to another. Romantic hardly. This was business wrapped in ceremony. Marriage was not about love. It was economics, politics, and property management all stitched together with hymns and a priest's blessing. Families arranged matches to secure land wealth or alliances. A girl's hand in marriage was less a tender gesture and more a bargaining chip. And the girl, she had about as much say as a chicken at a Sunday feast. The church technically declared 14 as the acceptable minimum age for marriage, but social practice pushed it earlier. Wealthy noble families often betrothed girls as soon as they were biologically capable of bearing children. That's the disturbing math. As soon as puberty hit, so did the marriage contract. For peasants, it sometimes happened later, since farming families needed their daughters' labor a little longer. But in noble halls, 12 was practically on time. Let's linger in the sensory details. Imagine the wedding itself, a cold stone church, candles sputtering in drafts, incense smoke heavy in the air, your body squeezed into a gown that barely fits because it was sewn for speed, not comfort. The floor is damp. The hymns echo like thunder in a cave, and all eyes are on you. Except they aren't on you, really. They're on your dowry, your family name, and what new doors this marriage will open. It's like being traded in a sports draft you didn't sign up for. Only instead of running laps, you're running a household. Instead of holding a ball, you're expected to hold heirs. And the stakes are far higher than missing a game. Your entire future is dictated in that moment. This practice was justified under the idea of securing stability. Families thought early marriages would protect their daughters from scandal, align them with stronger households, and ensure a lineage of heirs before mortality claimed them. After all, life expectancy wasn't long. Why waste time waiting for romance when survival demanded urgency? But beneath the practical logic lay a dark reality: children forced into adulthood without ever tasting freedom. For the young bride, marriage meant immediate responsibilities: cooking, cleaning, spinning, brewing, farming, all depending on her household's needs. And if her husband was older, which was often the case, she also became caretaker to a man who might already be set in his ways. Imagine being 12 and expected to manage a man in his 30s. It's the medieval equivalent of being handed a company and told, good luck, don't go bankrupt. The dangers were obvious. Pregnancy at such a young age was perilous. Bodies barely matured facing childbirth that could easily end in death. Mothers were lost to fever hemorrhage or infection. Newborns often didn't survive either. Every pregnancy was a gamble, and at 12, the odds leaned cruelly. Let's compare today. A 12-year-old worries about middle school schedules or whether Wi-Fi is working. Back then, a 12-year-old worried whether her first childbirth would kill her. It's like skipping from grade school straight into a high-stakes job interview with death as your boss. Not every marriage at 12 meant immediate consummation. Sometimes The church allowed a waiting period where the marriage was formalized but not physically enacted until the bride matured. But let's be honest, enforcement was thin, and many husbands ignored it. Records show countless cases of girls thrust into marital beds long before they were ready. The emotional cost was heavy. Imagine your peers still chasing each other in the fields while you're learning how to knead bread for your in-laws. Imagine your body aching from early pregnancies, your mind racing with fear, your freedom dissolved into endless duties. Even if you survived, you lived with the knowledge that your choices had never been yours. It wasn't all uniform misery. Some matches provided genuine companionship, and a few rare husbands respected their young brides enough to wait. But those were exceptions, bright sparks in a dark landscape. The norm was arrangement obligation and the stripping of youth. And here's where the irony deepens. The same church that preached the sanctity of marriage also turned a blind eye to the suffering it caused. The law might have drawn a line at 14, but loopholes and customs blurred it away. To them, marriage at 12 wasn't abuse, it was order. Think of it as medieval fast forward. Childhood erased, adulthood forced, freedom a rumor. Women were expected to grow into their roles like plants forced to bloom in frost. And if they failed, the blame was theirs, not the system's. You listening now might shudder at the thought, and you should. Imagine your 12-year-old self walking down that damp stone aisle, heart pounding not with joy, but with dread. The echo of your footsteps would feel louder than the choir, each one carrying you further from childhood, deeper into a life already written. This was the second disturbing fact. Girls barely old enough to braid their own hair were married into contracts that shaped kingdoms. They were pawns in games they never asked to play. Some historians think this was common. Others call it pure myth. But either way, the stories are enough to remind us that history's most celebrated castles and dynasties often rested on the shoulders of children forced to grow up too soon. And so, from veils of control to marriages of childhood, the path through medieval womanhood grows darker. Next, we step into the world of dowries as currency, where women weren't just brides, but walking treasure chests, measured in silver land and livestock. You step into a medieval hall, and before you even notice the smell of roasted meat or the glint of candlelight on stone walls, you hear numbers. Not numbers whispered about trade or crop yields, but about you. Your worth is calculated not by your smile, wit, or spirit, but by how many acres of land, sacks of grain, or bolts of linen your family can attach to your name. Welcome to the world of dowries, where women were turned into walking treasure chests with legs. In theory, a dowry was supposed to be a woman's share of inheritance, a kind of starter pack for her new household. In practice, it was a financial transaction that determined whether you got a husband at all. No dowry, no marriage. Or, if you did manage one, expect your prospects to be slim and your husband less than desirable. The dowry was less about you, more about what you carried into the marriage. Picture the scene, a father wrinkled parchment in hand bargaining with another man across a wooden table. His daughter stands nearby, veiled and silent, like a vase placed on display, but not allowed to speak. The men argue over sums: 2 cows, 5 silver coins, rights to a small plot of land. She is there in body, but absent in voice. The contract seals her future. The ink on that parchment means more than the girl's feelings ever will. The sensory details sting. The hall is thick with smoke, your veil damp from nervous sweat, the tang of iron ink filling your nose. Your heart beats louder, than the quill scratching across parchment. And yet you are silent because your worth has already been spoken for. Think of it like a medieval credit score. The richer your dowry, the better your rating. Families competed to show off their daughter's value by packing dowries with jewels, furniture, or livestock. Wealthy nobles offered castles, farmland, even political alliances disguised as gifts. Poorer families scraped together blankets, cooking pots, or a single cow. It didn't matter what it was. What mattered was that something accompanied you into the marriage bed. The cruel irony. Once the dowry was given, control shifted to your husband's family. Your supposed share rarely belonged to you. It was absorbed into his household, used for his ventures, or passed to his heirs. If you imagined the dowry as a safety net, you'd be disappointed. More often, it was a leash. Let's bring it into modern terms. Imagine going on a first date, and instead of being asked about your hobbies or dreams, you're asked, "So how much cash do you bring to the table?" That's the vibe. Or picture a wedding registry today, except instead of kitchen mixers and wine glasses, it's goats, acres, and silver. Non-negotiable. And the bride herself isn't even consulted. Dowries also served as a barrier. Women with large dowries had better matches. Women without them faced spinsterhood or worse, forced entry into convents. Entire lives were shaped not by education or personality, but by how much wealth your father could attach to your marriage contract. And remember, medieval society wasn't exactly kind to single women. Being left over often meant poverty suspicion or accusations of immorality. The scale of these transactions sometimes bordered on absurd. There are records of dowries so lavish that they bankrupted families, plunging fathers and brothers into debt just to secure a marriage match. Imagine bankrupting yourself to get rid of responsibility for your daughter. It's the medieval version of financing a car you can't afford just to show off at the village square. And let's not ignore the political stakes. In royal and noble circles, dowries were weapons of diplomacy. A king might marry off his daughter with a dowry of land so vast it altered the map. Marriages created alliances, secured borders, and bought peace treaties. That walking treasure chest wasn't just family property. It was statecraft, wrapped in a gown and sent across borders. For the bride, this meant her future rested entirely on her family's financial strength. A poor girl could be as virtuous, hardworking, and intelligent as possible and still find herself overlooked. Meanwhile, a wealthy but unremarkable girl could attract suitors from miles away. It's like applying for a job where your resume doesn't matter. Only the attached bank account does. Sometimes dowries created unexpected freedoms. Widows, for example, occasionally reclaim parts of their dowries as inheritance, giving them rare independence. In a world where women were usually bound to husbands, a reclaimed dowry might allow a widow to run her own household or business. But such cases were exceptions, not rules. For most, the dowry left their hands forever. There were also legal battles. If a husband mistreated his wife, families could threaten to reclaim the dowry, essentially blackmailing him into better behavior. But again, this wasn't about protecting her. It was about protecting the family's investment. She was the property, the dowry was the collateral, and love had no place in the equation. Think about the sensory humiliation. Imagine standing in your new husband's hall, watching him take inventory of what you've brought: a cow tied outside a chest of linen, dragged across the floor, silver coins counted one by one. You are introduced as the wife, but in whispers, you're labeled the dowry. It's disturbingly modern in some ways. Think about extravagant weddings today, where families pour fortunes into events that sometimes outlast the marriage itself. Back then, the spending wasn't on the party, it was on the bride herself. She wasn't celebrated, she was purchased. You sitting here now might imagine how suffocating it felt to know that your worth could be measured in cows, coins, or acres. To realize that the necklace you wore or the linens in your chest spoke louder than your own voice. To live in a system where your value was not who you were, but what you carried. And yet within this grim system, women endured. Some even found ways to bend the rules, managing dowry property behind the scenes, manipulating husbands with the threat of family intervention, or ensuring their daughters received more than they had. But the overarching truth remained: dowries reduced women to currency. So as you drift tonight, imagine walking into that candlelit hall, the ink drying on contracts that sealed lives. The chatter of men rises, the quill scratches, and you stand silent, your dowry speaking louder than your breath. This was the third disturbing fact: women were turned into treasure troves, measured and traded in livestock, coins, and land. And next, we'll step into something darker still: when marriages weren't negotiated, but stolen, when brides were taken not by choice, but by capture. You're walking home from the market basket, heavy with onions and stale bread, when suddenly you're not walking anymore, you're being dragged. A rough hand grips your arm, another clamps over your mouth, and before you can scream, you're hoisted onto a horse. This isn't a robbery for coins or goods. It's worse. This is marriage medieval style. Welcome to the disturbing tradition of bride capture, where love was sometimes nothing more than a polite form of kidnapping. The concept wasn't universal, but it happened often enough to leave a mark on folklore law and terrified women. Some cases were half romanticized, later retold as daring abductions that ended in true love. Others were brutal crimes cloaked in custom or brushed aside by communities that prioritize property over people. Either way, the woman's choice rarely mattered. Imagine the sensory chaos: the horse snorts, hooves pound the dirt road, and your veil slips sideways as you're jolted up and down your lungs, burning from trying to scream into a calloused palm. You smell sweat leather and fear. Every jolt of the ride feels like the world tilting against you. You don't know if you're heading to a hut in the forest, a rival village, or a wealthy man's manor, but you know your life has shifted in an instant. Bride capture took many forms. Sometimes it was outright violence, men banding together to snatch a woman fight off her family and ride into the night. Sometimes it was staged families colluded, pretending the bride was unwilling, when really the deal had been struck in whispers beforehand. And sometimes it was more symbolic, a gesture, in ritualized weddings, where taking the bride reminded everyone of the groom's dominance. The spectrum stretched from criminal to ceremonial, but the thread was always the same. Her will was irrelevant. Think of it as the medieval version of eloping, but without consent and with a lot more bruises. Instead of secret love letters and stolen kisses, it was rope's force and the weight of a community shrugging its shoulders. For noble families, abduction was sometimes a political act. A wealthy heiress might be stolen to secure land or inheritance rights. Kings and lords issued edicts trying to curb the practice, but the temptation of wealth carried on. The capture of an heiress wasn't just a scandal. It could spark feuds, wars, or even civil unrest. In those cases, the bride wasn't a person, but a pawn, her body carrying the weight of territorial claims. Among peasants, capture had a different flavor. Sometimes men used it as a shortcut when dowries or parental consent weren't available. If you couldn't afford a bride, you took one. Later, you might pay restitution to her family, offering gifts or livestock as apology. And sometimes, communities accepted the union once the dust settled, as though the violent beginning had been erased. The church condemned abductions, but enforcement was patchy. Laws existed declaring bride capture a crime, but penalties varied. Some men faced execution, others paid fines, and went on with their marriages. It depended on who you were, who you captured, and how much influence your family wielded. Justice, like always, was uneven. Let's compare it to modern terms. Imagine someone grabbing you from a coffee shop, dragging you into a car, and then a week later the law says, well, since you're already living together, maybe you're married now. Absurd, yes. But that was the medieval loophole one that left women trapped in unions forged through violence. There are even records of staged rescues. A man might abduct a woman with her consent, framing it as forced to dodge parental disapproval. Some of these stories evolved into romantic tales, the kind that troubadours sang about lovers so desperate they risked the law. But peel back the poetic verses, and the reality remained unsettling. Even when consensual, the framework of kidnapping reflected a society that accepted force as the language of marriage. The emotional aftermath was profound. For the abducted woman, even if she grew to accept or even love her captor, the trauma of that initial violence lingered. Trust was fractured before it began. For those who resisted life, could spiral into endless attempts at annulment, legal battles, or exile. Few won, most endured. Think of the humiliation, too. Your neighbors whisper about your abduction. The men laugh at the daring of your captor. The women shake their heads, but fall silent. You return to your village, not as yourself, but as a story, a scandal, a symbol of someone else's power. It's like the medieval equivalent of going viral for all the wrong reasons, except instead of memes, it's your body and future on display. And instead of being able to shut your phone off, you have to live with the consequences forever. Bride capture shows us the darker undercurrent of medieval marriage. Behind the veils and dowries lurked violence, coercion, and the normalization of force. For many women, marriage wasn't a choice. It was an ambush. You might think this sounds too brutal to be widespread, but sources from the time contradict each other entirely. Some accounts treat abductions as rare crimes. Others suggest they were common enough to warrant endless sermons and statutes. The evidence leaves the truth frustratingly unclear, but the fear it instilled in women was undeniably real. So picture this as you drift tonight: the sound of hooves vanishing into the distance, the flicker of torches in the dark, and a woman's muffled cries swallowed by the wind. For her, this wasn't a love story. It was captivity dressed as matrimony. And as you sit with that image, prepare for the next disturbing truth. Because if being kidnapped into marriage wasn't terrifying enough, imagine being locked in a convent for life, not as a calling, but as a convenient way to get you out of the way. That's where we go next. You wake up not to the warmth of a home, but to the echo of bells bouncing off stone walls. The sound isn't calling you to morning chores or market stalls. It's summoning you to prayer again and again and again. You are not here because you chose the cloistered life. You are here because someone decided it was cheaper, safer, or simply more convenient to shut you away. Welcome to the world of women, locked in convents, holy prisons, where vows of silence and chastity often replaced family and freedom. For medieval families, convents were convenient solutions. Got a daughter without a dowry. Send her to the convent. Too many heirs threatening to split the family estate. Lock one away in a veil of vows. A rebellious girl refusing an arranged marriage. Cloister her behind walls, problem solved. The convent was less about piety than about practicality. A woman's life could be redirected with one family decision sealed by a church ceremony she never wanted. Picture the sensory reality. Cold stone corridors stretch endlessly damp with the smell of mildew. Your feet are bare on icy floors, your hands red from washing linen in freezing water. Meals are bland, a watery broth, a crust of bread harder than your pillow. Silence weighs heavier than the thick walls. The air carries not laughter, but coughs, whispered prayers, and the occasional muffled sob. You are surrounded by women, yet feel utterly alone. To you today, a convent might sound peaceful. Gardens, libraries chanting. And yes, there were moments of learning and serenity. But for many, it was confinement. The vows of obedience stripped individuality, the rigid schedule erased freedom, and the locked gates barred escape. Think of it as a medieval boarding school, with no graduation date, no visiting privileges, and no option to drop out. Some families used convents strategically. By donating land or wealth alongside their daughter, they earned favor with the church. Nobles often parked extra daughters there, ensuring the family fortune stayed consolidated. It was estate management disguised as holiness. And for the church, more women meant more labor-free hands to cook, weave, and tend gardens, plus bodies to fill cold choir stalls and keep the prayers flowing. The age of entry varied. Some girls were offered as children, barely old enough to read, left to grow under strict abbesses. Others were sent after adolescence, often against their will. Imagine being 16, dreaming of a different life, and suddenly your father decides the convent will suit her. And that's that. One locked door later, your world shrinks forever. Let's compare it with something modern. Imagine your parents signing you up for a lifetime phone plan you can't cancel. No upgrades, no escape, just endless monotony. Except instead of scrolling through TikTok forever, you're chanting psalms in Latin at 4 a.m. with a sore throat. But here's the twist. Not all convents were equal. Wealthy abbeys for noblewomen offered education libraries and relative comfort. Some even allowed nuns to write poetry, compose music, or manage estates. A handful became centers of learning-preserving texts that would otherwise vanish. But poor convents, they were harsh. Crumbling walls, endless labor, meager food. For peasants shoved inside the convent was closer to a workhouse than a sanctuary. Women did carve out spaces of power within these walls. Some abbesses wielded authority greater than many men, managing land and commanding respect from bishops. In rare cases, convents offered a form of refuge better than poverty, safer than abusive marriages. For widows or women fleeing violence, the cloister could feel like salvation. But those cases highlight the problem. For most, it wasn't choice, but coercion. And imagine the loneliness. Festivals and feasts passed without you. Brothers, sisters, parents grew old while you remained behind walls. You might hear rumors of their lives through visitors or letters, but you'd never walk freely among them again. To survive, you trained your senses to embrace the small things, the warmth of a candle on cold hands, the rustle of turning pages in a borrowed manuscript, the fleeting joy of a sparrow fluttering in the cloister garden. It's the medieval equivalent of solitary confinement with group activities sprinkled in. The chants became your soundtrack, the stone your backdrop, the sky glimpsed only through narrow windows. Freedom was an idea you carried in silence, tucked away with your whispered prayers. Not surprisingly, some women resisted. There are scattered tales of escape attempts, climbing walls, bribing guards, even disguising themselves to slip away. But consequences were brutal. Captured runaways faced punishment not just from the convent, but from their families, who considered the escape an insult to honor. Rebellion wasn't just personal, it was sacrilege. The church painted convent life as holy, but many women inside felt the dissonance. Their prayers echoed with longing, their obedience with frustration. And some writings that survive, scribbled in margins of manuscripts, hidden in letters, hint at bitterness, humor, and a quiet rebellion of thought. You sitting here tonight might wonder what you'd do. Would you endure in silence, making peace with the chants and the rules? Would you dream endlessly of escape? Or would you, like some abbesses, learn to wield the system as power-cloaking ambition in piety? Whatever the answer, the truth remains. Countless women were locked away, not because they wanted God, but because others wanted them gone. Records disagree on whether this ever actually happened in the same numbers the stories suggest. Some historians argue most convent entries were voluntary acts of devotion. Others point to mountains of evidence showing coercion, family strategy, and despair. The truth, like the convent's shadows, is layered and difficult to pierce. So tonight, as you drift, imagine the bell tolling again. The sound is steady, eternal, both soothing and suffocating. It calls you to prayer, but it also reminds you of walls too high to climb, of a gate that never opens. This was the fifth disturbing fact: women locked in convents not by calling but by command. And from here, the story only sharpens. Because if life inside walls felt suffocating, what came next was deadlier still, the gamble of pregnancy, where every birth was a spin of the dice with death. You close your eyes for a moment, hoping for rest, but the sharp twist in your belly reminds you this isn't rest, it's labor. The midwife hovers with herbs and whispered prayers. Neighbors crowd the smoky chamber, and the air is heavy with fear more than anticipation. In medieval times, pregnancy was less a blessing and more a gamble. Every birth felt like rolling dice with death, and women knew it all too well. Childbearing wasn't optional, it was demanded. Marriage contracts, family expectations, and church doctrine all pushed women toward one purpose: producing heirs. A wife without children was branded barren, whispered about like a cursed field. But the cruel irony was that fulfilling this duty often meant dying from it. Pregnancy was roulette, with stacked odds. The wheel spun with every heartbeat, the prize survival, the penalty burial. Picture the sensory scene: a dim room, lit by a single candle, shadows flickering on cracked plaster walls. The smell of sweat smoke and blood mingles into something overwhelming. You grip a wooden stool so tightly, your nails split the wood damp from your palms. The midwife's voice cuts through the noise: breathe, breathe. Outside, church bells toll, indifferent to whether they'll ring for a baptism or a funeral. Medical knowledge was minimal. Midwives relied on herbs, charms, and experience passed from one woman to another. Some used poultices of crushed plants, others muttered incantations or tied charms around the mother's wrist. For pain, ale was common enough to dull the senses, but never enough to erase the agony. And when complications came, there was little anyone could do. Instruments were crude, infections common, and cesarean births almost always fatal for the mother. Think about it in modern terms. Today, pregnancy is monitored with ultrasounds, antibiotics, sterile rooms, and surgical teams. Back then, it was more like jumping into a river blindfolded, hoping the current would carry you to shore instead of dragging you under. And the current, it was almost always against you. Statistics from later centuries suggest maternal mortality was staggeringly high. Some estimates say 1 in 3 women died from complications of childbirth during their lifetime. Imagine living with that shadow every time your belly grew. So did the specter of death. Women didn't count children's birthdays with joy. They counted their own survival with relief. It wasn't just the birth itself. Pregnancy brought risks at every step. Miscarriages, stillbirths, fevers, hemorrhages, all common, all devastating. There were superstitions layered on top, too. Some believed a pregnant woman shouldn't look at fire, or she'd give birth to a red-haired child. Others thought cravings signaled the baby's character, or that too much sex during pregnancy would stain the child, and when something went wrong, blame fell on the mother. Had she angered, God failed in modesty, neglected a charm. The guilt piled on top of grief. The sensory toll extended long after delivery. Surviving mothers faced weeks of weakness, infections, or torn bodies that never fully healed. Childbed fever was especially feared an invisible enemy that crept in after birth, leaving women shivering, sweating, and often dead within days. Imagine lying in a straw-filled bed, your baby crying nearby, while your body burns and weakens with no cure in sight. And then there was the silence of loss. Infants often didn't survive, leaving mothers with empty arms and neighbors whispering that perhaps she hadn't prayed enough. Cemeteries filled with tiny graves, reminders that pregnancy roulette claimed not just mothers, but countless children too. It's like playing a slot machine where every spin is rigged, yet society demands you keep pulling the lever. If you stop, you're shamed. If you play and lose, you're mourned briefly before the cycle starts again. Families prepared for death as much as birth. Priests were on call to baptize infants moments after delivery, sometimes before the mother even knew if her child lived. Neighbors gathered not just to help, but to witness, to see if the household would add a member or lose one. Birth was community spectacle, part hope, part horror. Some midwives became legends, women with reputations for saving mothers against impossible odds. They guarded secret recipes of herbs, whispered charms, and practical knowledge. But even the best midwife couldn't guarantee survival. And when a birth went wrong, she often bore the blame, accused of witchcraft or incompetence. For women, resilience was the only weapon. They endured, they prayed, they supported each other through endless rounds of labor. Songs, prayers, and whispered encouragements filled the birthing rooms, small comforts against overwhelming fear. And when one woman survived, she became living proof to others that survival was possible, however uncertain. Imagine lying in that chamber, candlelight flickering, every muscle screaming, knowing the dice are rolling with each contraction. You don't know if you'll cradle a child or be carried to a grave. You don't know if your breath will steady or falter into silence. The roulette spins, and you wait for the outcome. You listening tonight might wonder how anyone endured. Perhaps they didn't think in terms of choice. They thought in terms of duty, survival, and faith. In a world where everyone lived under the shadow of mortality, pregnancy was just another battle in life's war. But for women, it was the most dangerous one. This was the sixth disturbing fact. Pregnancy in the Middle Ages was less a gift and more a gamble, a game played with stacked dice and cruel odds. And as you drift further into this journey, we'll step next into the chaos of noisy birth chambers, where the pain and fear of childbirth erupted louder than tavern brawls and echoed through entire villages. The night is quiet in the village, save for the occasional bark of a dog or the wind rattling shutters. But then a cry splits the darkness, not the thin wail of a newborn, but the raw guttural sound of a woman in labor. It rolls through the narrow lanes, bouncing off timber-framed houses, dragging every ear to attention. Medieval birth chambers weren't silent sanctuaries. They were loud, crowded, chaotic theaters of survival. Picture the scene: a dim room, candles burning low, thick air filled with smoke, sweat, and panic. The mother groans, screams, sometimes curses God himself, her cries so fierce they echo into the street. Neighbors pause their chores, children whisper nervously, and men glance toward the sound, but keep their distance. The birthing room was a world of women, sealed off from male authority, yet filled with noise so powerful it reminded the entire community of life's fragility. The chamber was never empty. Midwives, neighbors, female relatives, sometimes half a dozen women, crowded into a small space, each with a role to play. One held the mother's hand, another whispered prayers, another boiled water, while the midwife orchestrated it all like a conductor of chaos. And then there were the sounds, chanting psalms, whispered charms, groans that shook the rafters, and finally the shrill first cry of an infant if all went well. It's hard for us to imagine now, when modern births often happen behind hospital doors, muted by medication and sterile calm. But back then, birth was community theater. Everyone in the village knew when it was happening. Some homes had such thin walls that even distant neighbors could hear the ordeal. It was less private experience, more public event, loud enough to become part of the village's nightly soundtrack. Sensory overload filled every moment. The smell of herbs burning to ward off evil spirits mingled with the copper tang of blood. The floor was slick with straw, meant to soak up fluids turning underfoot with a squelch. The midwife's commands rang sharp, her voice trying to slice through the cacophony. Outside, villagers sometimes prayed aloud, their voices drifting into the chamber through cracks in the walls. Think of it as the medieval version of a reality show, except instead of cameras, it was gossip carrying the story. Everyone speculated, would the baby survive? Would the mother? Was the husband pacing or already preparing for a funeral? Each scream became fodder for whispers the next day. The noise wasn't just natural, it was ritual. Some communities believed shouting and chanting could scare away evil spirits trying to steal the newborn soul. Women recited charms, clapped hands, or rattled objects to confuse lurking demons. The louder the chamber, the safer the child, or so they hoped. Birth wasn't just biology. It was spiritual warfare fought with sound. The volume could be terrifying. Imagine you're a child, huddled under blankets, while your mother labors in the next room. Every scream feels like thunder, every chant like a spell, every silence like death's shadow creeping closer. You don't yet know whether you'll wake to a sibling's cries or the toll of church bells. Sometimes the noise turned to chaos. If labor dragged on tempers frayed, midwives argued over remedies, neighbors gossiped too loudly, and prayers turned to desperate wails. The birthing chamber became a storm of sound groans, arguments, sobbing, and the rattling of pots. in those moments, it was less a sacred rite than a battlefield of clashing voices. Modern comparison. It's like having a medical emergency while the entire neighborhood crowds into your bedroom, shouting advice, burning incense, and occasionally arguing about whether you sinned too much during Lent. Comforting. Not exactly. Overwhelming, absolutely. Noise also marked status. In noble households, births drew even larger audiences. Noblewomen, attendants, priests, sometimes even officials, ensuring the legitimacy of heirs. Imagine laboring while half your in-laws stood nearby, waiting to hear proof of the new bloodline. Privacy was a luxury only peasants sometimes had. For aristocrats, childbirth was practically a state affair, and the chamber roared with the hum of politics as much as pain. The cacophony left a deep cultural imprint. Medieval songs, poems, and even sermons reference the cries of childbirth as metaphors for suffering or redemption. To compare something to a woman's labor screams was to evoke raw power, endurance, and inevitability. The sound was unforgettable, etched into the memory of every villager who ever lived close enough to hear. And for the mother, the noise wasn't always supportive. Sometimes it heightened fear, reminding her how many women before her hadn't survived. The screams were her own, but they echoed the ghosts of others. Yet for some, the noise was strength, the chorus of women around her, loud and unyielding, insisting she was not alone in her battle. As you listen tonight, imagine lying on that straw-strewn floor, your body torn with contractions while voices rise all around you. The chamber is no longer a room, but a storm sounds crashing, like waves drowning your thoughts, until all that exists is pain noise and the hope of relief. This was the seventh disturbing fact. Medieval birth chambers were less serene sanctuaries than noisy battlegrounds filled with screams, chants, and chaos. And from this din, we move to the next reality, where survival wasn't the end of danger. Because once a child was born, the odds were cruelly stacked against it. Next, we face the bleak truth of high infant mortality, where silence often replaced the noise far too quickly. The cries of a newborn fill the air, shrill and fragile. But in the Middle Ages, those cries were never taken for granted. Too often, they faded into silence far too soon. For every noisy birth chamber that erupted in relief, there were countless homes that fell quiet, mourning infants who never reached their first birthdays. High infant mortality wasn't just a tragedy, it was an expectation. Medieval women lived knowing half their children might never survive long enough to speak their names. Imagine the sensory details of that moment. The baby's breath is shallow, its skin pale in the candlelight. The midwife leans close, listening for strength in those tiny lungs. Herbs are burned, charms are whispered, and anxious prayers fill the room. Mothers hold their children, as though squeezing tighter could keep death away. But death was a frequent visitor, slipping silently into cradles and leaving parents hollow. Numbers tell the grim story. Some estimates suggest nearly 1 in 3 infants died within their first year. By age 5, nearly half of all children were gone. Disease, malnutrition, infection accidents, any one of them could strike. For women, this meant endless cycles of pregnancy, not just to grow families, but to replace constant losses. The sound of lullabies was often followed by the toll of church bells. Causes were everywhere. The water was unsafe, spreading dysentery and fevers. Milk spoiled quickly, and when mothers couldn't nurse, alternatives like diluted animal milk carried risks of infection. Poor hygiene during births led to infections passed to babies before they even opened their eyes. Diseases we barely think of. Today, measles, whooping cough, smallpox were merciless killers. Let's compare with modern life. Today, losing an infant is a rare and devastating tragedy. Back then, it was routine, woven into the rhythm of family life. Parents sometimes avoided naming children until they survived infancy, fearing to attach love to lives too fragile. Imagine that delaying joy because death loomed too close. It's like buying a ticket for a show you're not sure will ever happen. Mothers carried the heaviest burden. They blamed themselves when children died, whispered accusations of failing in prayer, diet, or modesty. Neighbors added to the guilt, muttering that the mother must have sinned, eaten the wrong food, or been cursed. Some communities even believed an infant's death revealed divine judgment, turning grief into shame. The sensory toll lingered in every home. Cradles stood empty toys, unused tiny garments folded away. The smell of incense clung to rooms after funerals, a bitter reminder of lives extinguished too soon. Cemeteries filled with small graves, each one a story cut short. Women visited them, often laying flowers, whispering prayers, carrying grief as part of daily life. Even wealthy families weren't spared. Noble women who birthed heirs also buried them. Royal histories are filled with children lost before succession dynasties shaken by fragile infant lives. Castles echoed with the same silences that haunted peasant huts. Wealth bought better food and care, but not immunity from disease. Death was democratic, touching every cradle. In response, some mothers grew emotionally guarded. Chronicles describe women who bore 10 or 12 children, only to see half buried before adulthood. To survive emotionally, they learned to withhold some of their joy, until children proved resilient. It was a quiet self-defense, a way of protecting the heart from breaking too many times. Yet communities adapted rituals to ease the pain. Baptisms were often rushed within hours of birth, ensuring the child's soul was safe even if the body failed. Lullabies carried prayers as much as comfort, sung with hope that divine ears might listen. Mothers tied charms around cradles, placed herbs beneath pillows, or painted protective symbols on walls. Survival wasn't just medical, it was spiritual, woven into every breath and gesture. Imagine yourself as a medieval mother. You cradle your baby, its breath, soft against your chest. You sing softly, but in the back of your mind, you count every cough, every hiccup, every restless twitch as a potential omen. You pray harder than you breathe. And even as love swells in you, so does fear, the knowledge that tomorrow might leave your arms empty. The grief of infant death shaped medieval culture. Sermons warned parents not to grieve excessively, insisting that lost children were angels in heaven. Yet how could a mother silence her sorrow when she saw other babies survive while hers was taken? Communities tried to comfort, but the wound was too deep, repeated too often. It's the medieval equivalent of living in a world where every family photo has someone missing, where every lullaby has an echo of loss. The resilience required to keep bearing children, to keep loving despite repeated heartbreak, was extraordinary. Women endured not just the physical toll of constant pregnancy, but the emotional devastation of constant loss. You listening now might wonder how anyone coped. Maybe they didn't. Maybe they carried grief silently like stones in their pockets, heavy but unseen. Or maybe they leaned on faith, convincing themselves heaven was filled with the children they couldn't keep. Either way, survival meant learning to live alongside death, to love fiercely, while knowing love might be torn away. This was the eighth disturbing fact. High infant mortality haunted every household, turning joy into gamble and cradles into graves. And as we move forward, we leave the silence of lost infants to face another grim reality, where even the simple act of feeding a child became entangled with laws, hierarchies, and injustices. Next, we explore the world of breastfeeding laws, where even a mother's milk could be controlled by the men around her. You hold your newborn, close the warmth of its fragile body pressed against your chest, and instinct tells you to feed it. But in the Middle Ages, instinct wasn't enough. Even the act of breastfeeding was tangled in laws, customs, and interference from men who believed they knew best. A mother's milk, the most natural bond between woman and child, became regulated, bargained over, and in some cases denied. For medieval society, breastfeeding was more than nourishment. It was morality, economy, and power. Authorities, from priests to lawmakers, issued rules about who should breastfeed for how long and under what conditions. Some insisted noblewomen must not nurse their own children, arguing it weakened their health or distracted from household duties. Instead, wealthy families hired wet nurses, turning milk into a commodity. Meanwhile, poorer women were expected to breastfeed regardless of exhaustion, malnutrition, or their own wishes. Imagine the sensory details. A baby cries in a wooden cradle, its hunger piercing the air. The mother lifts it, but a stern priest reminds her of rules about purity during menstruation or after certain rituals. Or perhaps a wealthy lady sits in her chamber, forbidden from nursing, while another woman, often poorer, sometimes barely nourished herself, feeds the infant. The room smells of milk, sweat, and damp cloth, but the decision is never the mother's alone. In some regions, laws even specified how long women must breastfeed. 2 years was considered ideal, based on biblical precedent, but practicalities varied. If a mother weaned too early, she risked accusations of negligence. If she breastfed too long, she was mocked or scorned. And if she refused entirely, that could be seen as sin, selfishness, or even grounds for annulment in extreme cases. Think of it in modern terms. It's like the government passing a law about how long you must use a stroller, or neighbors reporting you if they think you bought baby formula too soon. Personal choice disappeared. Your body became a battleground of rules and judgment. Wet nursing revealed the economic divide. Wealthy families often sent infants away to rural wet nurses, sometimes for years. This meant mothers might not even see their children until they were walking. The emotional cost was devastating. Bonding lost affection. Stunted motherhood reduced to contracts. For poor women, being hired as a wet nurse was income, but it often meant neglecting their own children. Many lost their babies to malnutrition while feeding someone else's. The sensory contrast is striking. A noblewoman lounges in silks, her breasts untouched by her own child, while a peasant woman, rough hands, trembling, nurses 2 infants, at once hers thin and frail, the other plump and pampered. The air tastes of injustice as much as milk. Religious beliefs added another layer. Some sermons warned that sinful mothers could corrupt their children through their milk, passing on vices with every drop. A greedy woman would raise a greedy child, a lustful woman, a lustful one. This twisted theology turned breastfeeding into moral surveillance, making women fear their very bodies. And then there were the punishments. In certain towns, neglecting to breastfeed long enough could result in fines. Lawsuits emerged when wet nurses were accused of mistreating noble infants or failing to keep them alive. Women's milk wasn't just sustenance, it was evidence in court, weighed and measured by men who never felt the ache of nursing. Modern comparison. Imagine formula, companies suing mothers for not feeding correctly, or neighbors dragging you into court because your toddler switched to solid food too early. The absurdity mirrors the medieval meddling, except back then, the consequences were harsher and survival was on the line. Women pushed back quietly. Some mothers defied rules, sneaking to nurse their children in secret. Others ignored priestly warnings, trusting instinct over doctrine. And some, wet nurses, carved out power, charging high rates or demanding respect for the essential service they provided. Within the cracks of regulation, women asserted their agency, however limited. But the grief was real. Imagine a mother standing at a doorway, watching her infant carried away by strangers to be nursed elsewhere. The child's cries fade down the road, replaced by silence in her arms. Or picture a poor woman, her own baby, limp from hunger, while she feeds a noble child under threat of losing her wages. Milk became currency, but the cost was unbearable. You listening tonight might wonder how they endured. Perhaps they told themselves it was duty survival or God's will. Perhaps they buried their sorrow under prayers and routine. Or perhaps, like so many women across history, they simply carried the ache quietly invisible to those who made the rules. This was the ninth disturbing fact. Even breastfeeding, the most natural act of love, was seized by law, twisted by class, and burdened with guilt. And as we move forward, we'll see how this imbalance grew sharper still, when breastfeeding wasn't just regulated, but replaced, creating a hierarchy of milk, where wealth thrived and poverty withered. Next, we step into the world of wet nurse hierarchies, where even the simple act of feeding drew lines between survival and suffering. You picture a child swaddled in linen reaching instinctively for nourishment. But instead of nestling at its mother's breast, it's handed to another woman, poorer, older, or simply more suitable. In the Middle Ages, breastfeeding wasn't just personal, it was political. Wet nurse hierarchies turned milk into a commodity, dividing women into classes where one mother's loss became another's labor. At the top were wealthy noblewomen, often forbidden to nurse their own children. Physicians, priests, and husbands claimed breastfeeding weakened their health, damaged their beauty, or distracted them from household duties. The result, infants were passed to wet nurses sometimes within days of birth. Mothers remained untouched while other women did the work. The sensory contrast is sharp. In a castle chamber, silk curtains ripple in candlelight as a lady reclines, her hands perfumed with rosewater. In a cottage down the road, a wet nurse sweats over two cradles, her rough tunic damp, her body aching from feeding not just her own baby, but her employer's plump child. Her milk, her time, her energy, all divided, all bought. Wet nurses were ranked. The most sought after were healthy young, often from morally upright families. Manuals even advised against hiring women with certain temperaments. Hair colors or diets claiming such traits would corrupt the child through milk. Blame superstition or pseudoscience, but the effect was brutal. Poor women's worth was reduced to their breasts, and noble children grew fat, while peasant infants withered. Imagine the bitterness. A wet nurse watches her own child grow frail, its cries sharp with hunger, while her employer's baby thrives at her breast. Every gulp feels like betrayal, but wages buy bread, and bread means survival. Her grief is swallowed alongside her milk, silent but heavy. This wasn't just family choice, it was status. Hiring a wet nurse became a symbol of wealth, flaunted like jewelry or fine clothes. The more prestigious the wet nurse, the greater the prestige of the household. For noble women, not breastfeeding wasn't laziness, It was a statement. We are too important for that. Let's compare it to modern terms. It's like a billionaire hiring someone else to eat their vegetables for them while posting selfies with the dessert. The essential act is outsourced, and the burden falls on someone less privileged. Some wet nurses gained power. The most skilled or favored could demand high wages gifts, even lifelong patronage. Stories survive of noble children who bonded more with their wet nurses than their actual mothers, creating lifelong ties. In some cases, wet nurses became part of noble households, elevated above their station because of the bond forged in infancy. But these were exceptions, not the rule. Most lived harshly. Feeding two infants left their bodies drained, their health fragile. Malnutrition was common, and many buried their own children while sustaining another family's line. Society praised their sacrifice but rarely eased their suffering. The sensory reality was relentless. Sore breasts, cracked skin hunger gnawing at their own bellies, yet still they fed. Nights blurred into days as infants cried, needing nourishment every few hours. Sleep was scarce, exhaustion constant, and all the while they carried the knowledge that their own bloodline might weaken while another thrived. Religious and medical authorities added layers of judgment. Some claimed that a wet nurse's moral character seeped into the milk, shaping the child's soul. This made families picky, scrutinizing potential nurses as though they were choosing fine wine. Others argued that hiring a wet nurse too poor or sinful risked corrupting the infant's future. Women's bodies were not just judged, but mythologized, turned into moral battlegrounds over every drop of milk. And yet, despite these beliefs, necessity often overrode ideals. Families hired whoever was available, especially when infant survival hung by a thread. Sometimes, even monasteries employed wet nurses for foundlings or orphans. For the women, it was work grueling poorly, rewarded, and emotionally costly, but sometimes the only way to earn coin. You listening now might imagine the quiet cruelty of the moment. Picture a poor mother watching her child cry, then turning to feed another's baby while her own starves. Imagine the sting of knowing that her labor, her very body sustained, not her family, but someone else's legacy. And yet, resilience shone in small ways. Some wet nurses formed communities, sharing the burden, supporting each other, and creating bonds of solidarity. They whispered jokes, sang songs, and found comfort in the knowledge that they were not alone. Within the hierarchy, they carved out humanity, refusing to be reduced to vessels alone. The hierarchy of milk reveals the harsh divide of medieval life. Wealth meant outsourcing pain, poverty meant carrying it twice over. And through it all, women endured noble women, distanced from their own children, and wet nurses chained by need to nourish children who were not theirs. This was the 10th disturbing fact. Wet nurse hierarchies turned milk into money, dividing women into feeders, and the fed, the distant, and the drained. And as we move onward, the story deepens into another bodily burden, menstruation, where myths, shame, and absurd rules turned a monthly reality into a lifelong stigma. The moon waxes and wanes, and with it comes a cycle as old as humanity. But in the Middle Ages, menstruation wasn't seen as natural rhythm. It was painted as mystery, danger, and shame. Women bled every month, yet men wrote the rules about what it meant, and the result was a tangled web of myths that turned a bodily function into stigma. Picture the sensory details first. A woman crouches in the corner of a drafty hut, trying to manage with a rag of rough cloth, the air damp and heavy with smoke from the hearth. She shifts, uncomfortably, her belly cramping, while whispers swirl outside the door. Don't let her touch the bread. It won't rise. Keep her from the crops. She'll blight them. Even her shadow is suspect. The cycle that ties her to life is recast as a curse. Myths spread across Europe painted menstrual blood as toxic. Some believed it soured wine killed plants or rusted iron. Others claimed women on their period were dangerous to infants. If a menstruating woman looked at a baby, the child might sicken or die. These superstitions weren't whispered secrets. They were repeated in sermons, medical texts, even legal records. Authority sanctified the nonsense, and women bore the burden. The irony is sharp. Men relied on women to bear children, yet demonized the very process that made fertility possible. Monthly cycles were treated not as preparation for life, but as contamination. It's the medieval equivalent of banning someone from cooking in your kitchen. Because they're carrying the Wi-Fi signal, you don't understand it, so you call it harmful. Practical reality was grim too. There were no pads, no tampons, no clean bathrooms. Women used cloth scraps, moss, or nothing at all. Laundry was rare, water unsafe, and privacy non-existent. The smell of blood mixed with smoke and sweat impossible to hide in crowded homes. Discomfort became humiliation when combined with suspicion. Church teachings added another layer. Some priests declared menstruation proof of Eve's sin, the monthly reminder of women's fallen nature. During menstruation, women were sometimes barred from communion marriage beds, or even entering churches. Imagine being told your body was unworthy of God's presence for a week every month. For medieval women, faith and biology collided in shame. Medical writers weren't kinder. They described menstrual blood as excess poison that needed purging lest it rot the body. Some claimed if blood wasn't released, women went mad or developed mysterious fevers. Others warned against sex during menstruation, predicting monstrous children as punishment. It was less science, more superstition dressed in Latin. But women found ways to resist. Folk remedies described herbs for easing cramps or heavy flow. Whispered recipes passed between mothers and daughters. Some communities treated menstruation as purification, not punishment, recognizing it as part of balance. And within convents, records hint that nuns developed discreet methods to cope, carving out spaces of solidarity against outside myths. Imagine the sensory relief of finding another woman who understands. Sharing a cloth remedy, passing a joke, turning shame into survival. In the silence of male-dominated doctrine, women created their own small networks of knowledge, hidden but vital. Still, the stigma lingered. A menstruating woman was marked as unclean, her value diminished for a week each month. Husbands avoided her neighbors whispered, and children learned early that their mother's cycles were something to fear or mock. Shame became inheritance passed from one generation to the next. Modern comparison. It's like living in a world where half the population treats you as radioactive 1 week every month, and instead of questioning the absurdity, society writes laws and sermons to enforce it. You listening tonight might wonder how women endured centuries of being told their bodies were cursed. Perhaps they endured the way women always have, by surviving anyway, by creating small communities of care, by finding humor in the absurd. Maybe they rolled their eyes in silence when men lectured them just as women do today, when faced with myths dressed as wisdom. Historians still debate the extent of these beliefs. Some argue myths were exaggerated in texts, but less powerful in daily life. Others insist they shaped real behavior, restricting women's movements and deepening their isolation. The truth lies somewhere in between, but the fear women felt was real, even if the myths were inconsistent. This was the 11th disturbing fact. Menstruation in the Middle Ages wasn't just biology, it was burden stigma and superstition, turning natural cycles into social prisons. And from this monthly shame, we move to another lifelong reality where the very body of a woman was treated as currency. Next comes dowries and debts, where daughters were measured not in love, but in gold. The day should feel joyful, wedding bells, feasts, new beginnings. Yet for many medieval women, marriage wasn't romance, it was transaction. Dowries turned daughters into balance sheets, where the measure of a woman's worth was the weight of coin land, or linens her family could hand over. Love might flicker at the edges, but debts and bargains dominated the center. Picture the scene. A father sits at a rough-hewn table quill-scratching parchment as he calculates what his daughter is worth. A parcel of land here, a chest of linens there, a bag of silver coins if fortune permits. Across from him, the groom's family nods or frowns, haggling as if they're buying livestock at market. Meanwhile, the bride-to-be lingers by the door, her stomach twisting, not from excitement, but from the realization that her future rests on arithmetic she cannot control. Dowries weren't optional. They were the currency of marriage, securing alliances, elevating status, and ensuring a daughter's chance at a respectable future. Without one, a woman's prospects dwindled. Poor families sometimes couldn't provide dowries at all, consigning daughters to spinsterhood, or worse, to convents, where vows replaced freedom. Wealthier families bled themselves, dry selling land, or taking loans just to marry off their daughters. The sensory weight of debt clung to households. A mother whispers anxiously as she counts linens, the smell of mildew clinging to stored chests. Fathers mutter about debts owed, their hands trembling with ink stains. The bride's siblings eye her nervously, knowing their inheritance shrinks with every coin spent. The wedding feast might smell of roasted meat and spiced wine, but beneath the fragrance lies fear. Fear of financial ruin, modern comparison. It's like needing to buy a luxury car just to qualify for a marriage license, knowing the payments will haunt your family for years. Except in this case, the car is your daughter's future, and failure means disgrace. For women, the burden was double. They carried not only their family's hopes, but also their debts. A lavish dowry raised expectations they must honor the investment produce heirs and keep their husbands satisfied. A meager dowry left them vulnerable, often treated poorly by in-laws who viewed them as cheap. Either way, their bodies and futures were collateral. Dowries shaped alliances between families and even kingdoms. A noble woman's hand in marriage came with estate soldiers or trade rights. Princes measured brides by what lands they carried, not by affection. Queens were often pawns in continental chess games, their dowries serving as tools of diplomacy. Imagine being remembered in history, not for who you were, but for the gold and land that came with your name. Debt spiraled easily. Families took loans from moneylenders, risking foreclosure on farms. Some fell into cycles where younger daughters remained unmarried because the family still struggled to pay for elder sisters' dowries. The stress weighed heavily on mothers, who often scrambled to sew linens or hoard coin, praying it would be enough to secure their daughters' futures. The sensory toll followed brides into marriage. A woman carried the whispers of her dowry wherever she went. Relatives muttered if her marriage prospered. Of course, her dowry was so rich. If it failed, what did you expect with so little? Every joy and sorrow was framed through coin. Even her husband might measure affection by wealth, treating her not as partner, but as asset. Some women resisted in small ways. Stories tell of brides who clung fiercely to their dowries, managing them independently or using them as leverage in disputes. Others whispered curses over paltry chests, joking bitterly that their value had been miscalculated. But for most, resistance was impossible. The weight of expectation crushed quietly like dust beneath stone. Historians note that dowries created paradoxes. They gave women property, yet stripped them of control. A rich dowry could empower a bride, giving her status in her husband's household, but it could just as easily reduce her to a price tag, her worth, measured only in goods delivered. It was empowerment wrapped in chains. You listening tonight might imagine sitting at that table as your fate is decided. You have no say, no power to alter the sums. Your future husband doesn't glance at you. He studies the ledger. And when the deal is done, you walk into a marriage already marked by debts you never chose. This was the 12th disturbing fact. Dowries and debts turned women into transactions, binding their futures to coin and contract rather than love. And as we move forward, the ledger grows darker still, for marriage was not always a sanctuary. Next, we step into marital coercion, where vows of union too often masked lives of control and abuse. The vows were spoken before God, the feast was loud, and the bride's veil shimmered in the candlelight. But when the doors closed and the guests left, marriage in the Middle Ages was rarely a partnership of equals. For countless women, a due became less a promise and more a prison sentence. Marital coercion. The polite phrase for what we'd call abuse was both legal and expected, turning homes into cages. Picture the sensory weight of it. A bride sits by a fire, the smell of smoke sharp in her hair, her wedding dress traded for rough wool. Her husband looms nearby, his voice raised, his hands not gentle. Outside, the village celebrates the union with laughter and ale. Inside, she learns the truth. Her vows are chains. The sounds of merriment filter faintly through the walls, mocking her isolation. The law gave husbands sweeping control. A wife's body belonged to her husband. Marital rape was not recognized as a crime. Beatings were tolerated, sometimes even encouraged, so long as they didn't cause permanent injury. Legal codes in some regions even allowed husbands to strike wives for correction, the same way they disciplined servants. The message was clear. Obedience was expected. Resistance was punished. Modern comparison. Imagine a contract where you sign away your right to say no forever. Except it's not just a contract, it's a sacrament blessed by the church, enforced by law, and reinforced by gossip. Refusing a husband's demands wasn't rebellion, it was sin. The sensory realities compounded the cruelty. Women bore bruises hidden beneath long sleeves, whispered excuses to neighbors, and lived in houses where silence felt heavier than walls. The smell of stale ale on a husband's breath, the creak of floorboards announcing his steps, the slam of a door, all became signals of fear. Nights were restless, sleep broken by dread. Church teachings offered little refuge. Priests preached obedience, urging wives to endure for the sake of their souls. Marriage was considered indissoluble, and separation nearly impossible. Women who fled risked scandal, poverty, or punishment. Some texts even declared suffering at a husband's hand a form of piety, a chance to imitate Christ's endurance of pain. It was a grim theology that sanctified submission. Not all men were cruel, of course. Chronicles include tender marriages, husbands who treated wives with care and respect. But the structure of law and custom tilted sharply against women, leaving them powerless if trapped in coercion. Even noble women, whose wealth might have offered some shield, found themselves confined. Letters from queens and countesses reveal pleas for protection from abusive husbands, pleas often ignored. Communities enabled the silence. Neighbors heard shouts, saw bruises, and shrugged. That's marriage, they muttered, not our concern. Women endured with few allies, their suffering rendered invisible by normalization. The hearth meant to be warm became a site of fear. And yet women found ways to resist quietly, subtly, desperately. Some withheld affection. Others sought refuge in convents where vows to God offered an escape from vows to men. A few wielded wit or gossip as weapons, shaming husbands into better behavior. Rarely courts intervened, but justice was the exception, not the rule. Imagine, as you listen tonight, the suffocating contradiction. The church bell tolls to bless your marriage. The community toasts your union, but in the privacy of your home, you are silent struck or forced into submission. There is no recourse, no court, no priest who will intervene. The vows that promised love now sanction control. The sensory burden lingers, the scrape of a wooden bench as you shrink away. The taste of blood after a slap. The weight of a hand that feels more like shackle than comfort. These were not rare horrors. They were daily realities for many medieval women. Historians note the paradox: marriage was both protection and peril. It offered women social status, economic survival, and a place in community. Yet it simultaneously bound them into relationships where coercion was tolerated. Women who resisted risked ruin. Women who endured carried scars, visible and invisible. Modern readers may wonder why they stayed. The answer is stark. Where could they go? Family homes were no refuge. Convents often closed their doors, and villages judged runaway wives harsher than violent husbands. Survival meant staying enduring, hoping the tide of cruelty would ebb. This was the 13th disturbing fact. Marital coercion turned unions into cages, leaving women bound by vows they couldn't break, in homes they couldn't escape. And as we move forward, we'll see that coercion wasn't only about marriage beds, it extended into the courts of faith and superstition. Next, we enter the shadowed realm of witch branding, where suspicion alone could ignite flames and turn women into symbols of evil. The night is heavy, with the smell of wood smoke, but it isn't the comforting scent of hearth fires. Instead, it's the acrid sting of burning pitch and fear. In the Middle Ages, suspicion alone could brand a woman as a witch. A bad harvest, a sick cow, or a neighbor's grudge, any misfortune could be pinned on her. Witch branding wasn't just about superstition. It was a weapon of control wielded against women who didn't conform. Picture the scene: a woman walking through a village square, her head covered in a plain wimple. A group of men glance sideways, muttering. She lives alone, grows herbs, maybe speaks too boldly. That's enough. Soon, whispers swell into accusations, and suddenly her name is stained. She doesn't carry a broom, but the word witch clings to her like smoke, impossible to wash away. The sensory assault followed her everywhere. Eyes burned holes in her back as she passed. Children threw stones, mothers pulled them close, and markets refused her coin. The smell of herbs in her basket became evidence. The sound of her prayers, if too loud or too strange, proof of sorcery. Silence could damn her as easily as speech. Witch branding wasn't confined to the infamous trials of later centuries. Even in the medieval period, the seeds of fear were planted. Manuals written by clerics warned of women's susceptibility to demonic influence. Physicians claimed female bodies were weaker, more prone to corruption. The church taught that women's desire, curiosity, and disobedience were gateways for the devil. The logic was circular. Women were accused of witchcraft because they were women. Imagine the absurdity in modern terms. It's like your Wi-Fi goes down, and instead of blaming the router, you accuse the neighbor who bakes sourdough bread too often. Then you convince yourself her yeast starter is a satanic pact. That was the level of superstition that haunted daily life. The branding often stuck without trial. A simple rumor could ruin a woman's life. Marriage prospects evaporated, friendships dissolved, livelihoods collapsed. Some women fled to convents for protection, though even there whispers followed. Others lived in isolation, their lives shrunken by suspicion. And when authorities did take action, the results were terrifying. Trials by ordeal demanded women prove innocence by plunging hands into boiling water or being thrown into rivers. Survive, and you might be spared, but the scars remained. Fail, and you were declared guilty, punished, sometimes executed. It was a system where the dice were loaded, the outcome nearly always cruel. The sensory terror of such ordeals is chilling. The hiss of boiling cauldrons, the icy shock of river water, the crowd's roar as they watched. The smell of scorched skin, the cries of pain, the silence when a body floated. These weren't isolated events. They were spectacles, lessons to remind other women of the cost of stepping out of line. Historians disagree on how widespread witch trials were in the medieval period compared to later centuries. Some argue they were rare, exaggerated by later accounts. Others insist they were frequent enough to leave deep scars in memory. What's certain is the fear was real. Even if not every village burned witches, every woman knew the risk of accusation. For some, the label was permanent. A woman once branded a witch could never wash away the suspicion. Even if she survived an ordeal, neighbors eyed her with distrust. Her children carried the stain, mocked or shunned as offspring of a witch. The brand passed invisibly, echoing across generations. And yet resilience surfaced. Some women leaned into the accusations, using the fear to carve out authority as healers or wise women. If villagers feared them, they also needed them. Herbs for childbirth, charms for illness, witches provided what priests and physicians couldn't. Fear became a kind of power, though dangerous, always balanced on a knife's edge. You listening now might imagine the weight of living under that suspicion. Every look, every whisper, every storm cloud carried threat. Your identity no longer belonged to you. It was written by others, branded in fear, and all it took was one neighbor's grievance for your life to unravel. This was the 14th disturbing fact. Witch branding turned suspicion into a scar marking women as monsters for the crime of existing differently. And as we move onward, the obsession with purity and danger takes a new turn into the strange world of bathing taboos, where staying clean could actually make you suspicious. You might think water offers relief. Warm baths, fragrant soaps, the luxury of feeling clean. But in the Middle Ages, bathing was tangled in shame, suspicion, and risk. For women, especially, stepping into a bath could mean vulnerability, gossip, or even accusations of immorality. Staying clean wasn't always seen as virtuous. Sometimes it marked you as dangerous. Picture the scene: a wooden tub set in a dim cottage corner, steam curling into the smoky air. A woman lowers herself into lukewarm water, her skin prickling with relief. But outside, neighbors whisper, "Why does she bathe so often? Is she hiding something?" The sound of water splashing becomes evidence of vanity, lust, or even witchcraft. Cleanliness was never just cleanliness, it was loaded with meaning. Medical theories fed the fear. Physicians warned that hot baths opened pores, making women more vulnerable to illness or temptation. They claimed steam could awaken desires, linking bathing to lust. Religious voices joined in urging modesty and condemning indulgence. The result? Women were often discouraged from bathing too frequently, especially alone. The natural act of washing became moral territory, policed by others. The sensory details could be grim. Without soap as we know it, baths smelled of herbs vinegar or fermented concoctions. Water was reused murky with dirt and oils. Public bathhouses reeked of sweat smoke and mildew. For women, the shame was doubled: first for being there at all, second for being seen as too eager to wash. What should have been comfort was often humiliation. Public bathhouses were especially fraught. In many towns, they doubled as places for prostitution, blurring the line between cleansing and sin. A woman entering a bathhouse might be assumed immoral regardless of her purpose. The hiss of heated water, the chatter of voices, the faint smell of sex in the air, all tainted women's reputations. Even married women risked their honor if spotted too often. Modern comparison. It's like being judged for going to the gym, not for fitness, but because people assume you're cheating on your spouse there. Ordinary routines became scandal by association. Wealth added another layer. Noble women often had private baths, wooden tubs lined with cloth, scented with roses or lavender. But even then, bathing carried risks. Servants gossiped, rumors spread, and the line between luxury and vanity blurred. Some nobles limited baths to a few times a year, fearing illness, shame, or both. Cleanliness was a privilege, but one wrapped in suspicion. Yet the irony was constant. The same authorities who warned women against bathing scolded them for smelling unclean. Husbands demanded wives be presentable, yet modest, clean, yet not indulgent. It was a tightrope with no safe side. Women bore the brunt, accused of filth if they didn't bathe, accused of sin if they did. Some women found small rebellions. They bathed in rivers at dawn, the cold shocking, but the secrecy liberating. They shared remedies of herbs and oils, trading recipes for scent and cleanliness. Within their own circles, they reclaimed bathing as self-care, even if society framed it as indulgence. The sensory relief of those stolen moments was profound. Cool water on skin sticky with sweat, the rustle of reeds hiding them, the smell of mint or rosemary crushed in the hands. For a short time, shame dissolved, replaced by freedom. But the risk of being seen never faded. Historians debate the frequency of bathing. Some argue it was common in certain regions, others that it was rare. What's clear is that women's experiences were shaped less by access and more by judgment. Bathing was never neutral. It was tied to morality, health, and reputation. You listening tonight might imagine stepping into that tub, the water cooling quickly, the door creaking as someone passes outside. Every splash feels like exposure, every sigh of comfort like a sin. The weight of eyes you cannot see presses down, reminding you that even here in supposed privacy, you are not free. This was the 15th disturbing fact. Bathing for medieval women was burdened with shame, suspicion, and moral policing, turning cleanliness into controversy. And from water, we move to fire next. We explore the danger of childbirth fever, where the very act of bringing life so often ended in death. The cries of labor echo through a dim chamber, rough walls lit by flickering candles. Sweat beads on the mother's forehead as midwives bustle around their hands, bare their tools unwashed. The air is heavy with smoke from the hearth and the sharp tang of herbs. And in this fragile moment where new life should bloom lurks a silent killer. Childbirth, fever, the invisible plague of mothers claimed countless women in the Middle Ages. This wasn't a rare tragedy. It was common enough that families half expected it. Women knew each birth might be their last, and whispers of childbed fever carried terror. The sensory experience was brutal hours of contractions, the sting of rough cloths, the overwhelming smell of blood and sweat. And when the child was finally delivered, the danger wasn't over. Days later, fevers rose, wounds festered, and mothers slipped away while their newborns cried in empty arms. Today, we call it puerperal fever, often caused by infection. But in the Middle Ages, no one understood germs. Midwives went from one birth to another without washing, carrying death in their hands. Priests blamed sin. Physicians muttered about imbalanced humors. Neighbors whispered curses. Women endured the fevers, in silence burning from within their breaths, shallow, their skin damp with sweat that smelled of decay. The grief weighed heavily on households. Imagine the sound of a newborn's wail beside the labored breaths of a fading mother. The baby swaddled in linen, the mother shivering despite heavy blankets. Neighbors shuffled in and out, muttering prayers, the scent of incense masking the stench of infection. For husbands, joy turned to despair in days. For children, mothers vanished before memories could form. Modern comparison. It's like surviving heart surgery, only to die because the surgeon forgot to wash their hands. The absurdity shocks us now, but then it was ordinary, a cruel rhythm of life. The church tried to soften the fear. Women were churched after birth, blessed and purified for surviving labor. But many never returned, for that blessing carried instead to church on funeral biers. Cemeteries filled with women in their 20s and 30s, their graves marked not by age, but by the number of children they bore. For midwives, suspicion grew. When women died, they were accused of incompetence, or worse, witchcraft. Yet these same midwives were the only hope for survival, walking contradictions of trust and fear. Some developed herbal remedies, poultices, or rituals, though results were mixed at best. Still, women clung to any chance of easing the danger. The sensory toll on families was crushing. A household once filled with the warmth of a newborn's cries now echoed with silence. The smell of milk, soured in bowls, left untouched. The fire burned lower as grief dulled daily tasks. Widowers remarried quickly, not always from love, but from necessity. Children grew up calling stepmothers mother, while the memory of the one who bore them was buried under time. Historians estimate maternal mortality in childbirth reached staggering levels, sometimes 1 in 10 births, sometimes higher in poor or crowded regions. Women knew their odds, yet they bore children anyway, driven by duty, expectation, or hope. The courage required was immense. Each pregnancy was a gamble with death. And yet resilience endured. Women supported one another through labor, singing hymns, whispering prayers, holding hands during the waves of pain. They shared knowledge of herbs like sage pennyroyal or rue remedies passed from one generation to the next. Even when science failed, them solidarity offered strength. You listening tonight might imagine lying in that chamber, sweat stinging your eyes, pain splitting your body, the midwife's hands rough but determined. You deliver life into the world, But as you hold your child, fever coils in your veins. You wonder if your last lullaby will be the first your baby ever hears. This was the 16th disturbing fact. Childbirth fever turned the gift of life into a roll of dice, where too often the cost of new beginnings was a mother's end. And as we move onward, the story shifts from blood to hunger. Next, we explore the dietary restrictions that bound women's bodies, where food itself became another arena of control. You sit at a long wooden table, the firelight dancing against trenchers of bread and bowls of stew. The smell of meat drifts through the hall, but you are not invited to eat it. In the Middle Ages, food was never simply nourishment. It was rank, gender, and morality served on wooden plates. For women, dietary restrictions carved invisible cages around their appetites, turning meals into lessons in obedience. Noble banquets overflowed with roasted boar venison pies and spiced wine. Yet noble women were often expected to eat sparingly to prove modesty and restraint. A woman with too hearty an appetite was mocked as greedy or lustful, her character judged by each bite. The sensory torment was real, the rich aroma of roasted goose filling the room while you forced yourself to nibble at bread and sip watered ale, smiling politely through hunger. For poorer women, restriction wasn't choice, but necessity. Their diets leaned heavily on dark bread porridge cabbage onions. Meat was rare, dairy uncertain, and hunger constant. Malnutrition stalked mothers who gave portions to husbands and children first. A woman's role was sacrifice her plate always emptier, her stomach always second. The church imposed further rules. Fasting days, often twice a week, stripped tables of meat and dairy. Lent stretched 40 days, demanding abstinence from rich foods. While these rules applied to all women, bore sharper burdens expected to maintain piety through compliance. Pregnancy or nursing rarely exempted them, leaving many weak and vulnerable. Modern comparison. Imagine your diet constantly policed your boss, tells you to eat salads for modesty. The government bans meat half the week, and your family expects you to serve dinner, but not take seconds. Every bite judged every meal a test of virtue. Medical theories added layers of absurdity. Physicians claimed women's bodies were colder and wetter than men's, unsuited for heavy foods. Too much red meat, they warned, made women coarse or unfeminine. Spices were said to inflame lust, so women were cautioned against pepper, cinnamon, or cloves. The kitchen became a battlefield of control, where recipes were written not just in ingredients, but in ideology. The sensory consequences were stark. Women's bellies ached with hunger as they served steaming dishes they weren't allowed to share. Their hands smelled of garlic, onions, and smoke, while their own portions were thin gruel. At feasts, they watched men gnaw on dripping haunches of meat, the crack of bones echoing the fat gleaming in torchlight. The injustice was as tangible as the food itself. Hunger shaped lives. Malnourished mothers risked losing infants to weak milk. Poor diets stunted growth, sapped energy, and deepened vulnerability to disease. Women bore the physical cost while still expected to labor in fields, kitchens, or nurseries. Hunger wasn't metaphorical. It gnawed daily, a companion as constant as the church bell. Yet some women found defiance in food. Noble women sometimes indulged in secret feasts with confidants, savoring roasted birds or sweetmeats behind closed doors. Peasant women tucked away eggs or cheese hidden from husbands or lords, tiny acts of survival. Recipes and remedies circulated quietly: soups to strengthen after childbirth, herbs to ease exhaustion, knowledge passed like contraband among those who needed it most. The irony, those same authorities who starved women also criticized them for weakness. A fainting wife was pitied or mocked her delicate constitution, blamed while the system that kept her hungry was ignored. Hunger became both punishment and stereotype, defining women as fragile while ensuring they remained so. Historians still debate how strictly these restrictions were followed. Some argue women had more freedom in daily meals than records suggest. Others insist the weight of doctrine and custom pressed hard. What's certain is that women's appetites were never neutral. They were measured, monitored, moralized. You listening tonight might imagine sitting at that table, the warmth of food inches away, the laughter of others filling the hall. Your stomach growls, but you smile, bow your head, and let the platter pass. Hunger scratches at your insides, but modesty and obedience demand silence. The meal is not yours to enjoy. It is yours to serve. This was the 17th disturbing fact. Dietary restrictions turned meals into tools of control, making hunger a lifelong companion for women in the Middle Ages. And as we step forward, the burdens shift from food to faith. Next comes confession pressure, where even thoughts became sins, and women's voices were forced into whispers before the church. The church door creaks as you step inside, the cool stone air wrapping around you like a cloak. Incense lingers thick and sweet, masking the faint must of mildew. A wooden screen separates you from the priest, but not from the weight pressing down. You must confess. For medieval women, confession wasn't only spiritual cleansing, it was surveillance, obligation, and pressure to bear the most intimate parts of themselves. Picture the scene: a woman kneels on cold stone, her hands damp with sweat, her heart thudding as the priest clears his throat. What does she confess? A sharp word to her husband, a missed prayer, a forbidden thought about freedom, desire, or anger. Every detail becomes sin. The rustle of her veil, the echo of her whispers, they all fold into the silence of the confessional. A silence that feels less like mercy and more like interrogation. Confession was mandatory, especially after the Fourth Lateran Council in 1215, which required annual confession for all Christians. For women, this meant constant scrutiny. Priests asked pointed questions about sexuality, obedience, and purity. Did she submit to her husband? Did she indulge in lustful thoughts? Even her dreams could be framed as sinful. The confessional was not just a booth. It was a net pulling every secret into clerical hands. The sensory discomfort was relentless. Kneeling for hours left legs numbstone, biting through thin cloth. The priest's voice, muffled yet stern, cut into the quiet. Incense clung to her clothes, mingling with the salt of nervous sweat. Each whispered answer echoed in her head long after she left, lingering like a bruise. Modern comparison. Imagine your browser history being read aloud every week to your boss, your family, and your pastor all at once. That was the level of exposure women felt. Private thoughts turned into public shame under the guise of salvation. Confession also reinforced hierarchy. A man's sins, gambling, drunkenness, violence, might be brushed aside as weakness. A woman's sins, impatience, jealousy, bodily desire, were treated as proof of her fallen nature. The scales were uneven, yet women bore them quietly. Some priests exploited this system. Records hint at confessors who asked prying, even indecent questions, blurring spiritual guidance with control. Others used women's confessions as leverage, threatening exposure or demanding penance that bordered on humiliation. A whispered sin could become a weapon held over women already trapped by social expectations. The irony: confession was meant to offer freedom, yet many women left feeling bound tighter. They returned home carrying not only guilt for real faults, but also shame for imagined ones. The church taught them their thoughts were dangerous, their bodies suspect their voices sinful. In confessing, they internalized the very control that oppressed them. And yet women found resilience here too. Some confessed strategically, offering small sins to mask larger secrets. Others found genuine comfort in the ritual, using it as space to unburden grief or fear. In convents, nuns sometimes confessed to one another, reshaping the act into mutual support rather than surveillance. Even under pressure, women carved out slivers of agency. The sensory relief of honest confession when it came could be profound. Tears spilled, shoulders shook, breaths released. The smell of incense and wax seemed softer, the echo of the priest's absolution gentler. For a moment the burden lightened, though the structures of control remained. Historians debate how oppressive confession truly was. Some argue it was liberating, offering medieval people space to process inner turmoil. Others highlight its role in reinforcing patriarchy, where women's bodies and minds were policed through ritual. Likely, it was both comfort for some, coercion for many. You listening tonight might imagine kneeling in that confessional. Your knees ache, your voice trembles, and as you whisper sins you barely understand, you feel smaller with each word. The screen hides your face, but not your shame. When you rise, you carry the weight of being told once again that who you are is flawed at the core. This was the 18th disturbing fact. Confession pressure turned women's inner lives into open ledgers, demanding exposure of every thought and desire. And as we move forward, the scrutiny tightens further, shifting from soul to body. Next, we uncover the world of virginity tests, where women's worth was measured not in character, but in flesh. The wedding is arranged, the dowry counted, the feast prepared. But before the vows, before the bed, one final test lingers like a blade at a woman's throat: her virginity. In the Middle Ages, virginity wasn't a private matter. It was currency, reputation, and proof of family honor. And for women, the pressure to prove purity was both humiliating and dangerous. Picture the scene. A young bride sits in a chamber, her heart pounding harder than the drums echoing from the feast outside. Noble relatives murmur nearby, their whispers thick with expectation. She is not nervous about the marriage vow, or even the man she barely knows. She is terrified of what will happen once the bed curtains are drawn, and of what evidence the sheets will show. Virginity tests took many forms, none humane. In some regions, midwives examined girls, physically claiming to detect signs of intactness. In others, proof came from the marriage bed itself, blood-stained sheets displayed to relatives or the public as tokens of honor. The sensory details are unbearable: the rough linen chafing against skin, the metallic tang of blood, the shame of knowing your body is a spectacle. Modern comparison. Imagine your employer demanding proof of your first kiss, notarized and on paper before you're allowed to start work. Absurd, invasive, and cruel, yet for medieval women, it was daily reality. Virginity was more than personal virtue. It was social capital. Families depended on it to secure alliances. A daughter who failed to prove her purity could ruin her lineage's reputation, leading to broken contracts, lawsuits, even violence. For noble women, the stakes were higher. Entire kingdoms balanced on the proof of one young woman's body. The church reinforced this obsession. Priests praised virginity as the highest female virtue, urging women to emulate the Virgin Mary. Chastity was painted as holy, while desire, even within marriage, was suspect. The paradox was, suffocating women were demanded to be pure before marriage, fertile after, and chaste again, if widowed. Their bodies were never their own. They were scripts written by others. The sensory humiliation reached its peak in public displays. Imagine sheets held aloft in a crowded hall, drunken relatives cheering at the stains, servants gossiping, neighbors whispering. A bride's most intimate moment transformed into theater. And if the sheets stayed clean, suspicion poisoned her life. She might be accused of deceit, pressured to undergo examination, or even cast aside. Medical myths added further cruelty. Some physicians claimed they could detect virginity by urine color gate or even the sound of a girl's voice. Others insisted the hymen was infallible proof, ignoring how easily it could break from riding labor or simple movement. Women's bodies became puzzles solved poorly, with their futures hanging on flawed guesses. For many women, survival meant silence and ingenuity. Some used herbs or animal blood to stain sheets, desperate to meet expectations. Others whispered advice to sisters, sharing tricks to escape disgrace. Virginity became less about reality and more about performance, a theater of blood and rumor staged for male approval. The irony, men's purity, was rarely questioned. Grooms could arrive with mistresses, bastards, and tavern tales without consequence. Women, meanwhile, lived under a microscope, their futures hinging on a single night and a single stain. The imbalance was staggering, yet normalized. Historians still debate how widespread these practices were. Some argue public displays were rare, dramatized in chronicles. Others believe they were common enough to terrify generations of women. The truth may lie in between, but fear alone left its mark. You listening tonight might imagine lying in that bed, your body trembling, as much from expectation as from fear. The curtains rustle, footsteps, echo, laughter carries from the hall. You know that tomorrow the whispers won't be about your smile or your gown, but about your sheets. And you realize your worth is measured not by who you are, but by what others see or fail to see on linen. This was the 19th disturbing fact. Virginity tests reduced women to symbols of purity, turning intimacy into spectacle and flesh into evidence. And as we close this journey, one more truth remains: the myths and legends that blurred reality itself, shaping how medieval women were remembered long after their lives ended. Next, we enter the realm of legends and lies, where stories outlive the women who bore them. The candle burns, low shadows flicker along the walls, and the whispers of history grow faint. Yet what lingers from the Middle Ages is not always truth, but story legends and lies that outlived the women themselves. For countless medieval women, their lives were rewritten after death, shaped by rumor, myth, or morality, plays designed to teach lessons rather than preserve truth. Picture it: a peasant woman who lived quietly, tending goats, raising children, fading into the rhythm of village life. Centuries later, her memory surfaces in folklore not as herself, but as a cautionary tale. She is cast as a witch who soured milk, or a saint who endured miracles, or a harlot who lured men to ruin. Her real laughter, her real hunger, her real fears are gone. What remains is a mask, a story written by others. Legends stretched across Europe, blurring fact and fiction. Joan of Arc became both heroine and heretic, depending on who told her story. Queens were remembered for scandal more than governance. Local healers became sorceresses, widows became poisoners, and girls who resisted marriages were painted as tragic martyrs. The sensory details of their real lives, muddy shoes, calloused hands, whispered prayers, were erased, replaced by archetypes that fit what men wanted remembered. The church played a central role in shaping these stories. Hagiography's lives of saints elevated certain women as paragons of chastity and suffering models to inspire others. But in glorifying their endurance, these texts often stripped away complexity. Saints were remembered for purity, not for humor, doubt, or anger. The lie was not always slander. It was simplification, flattening women into symbols. Modern comparison. It's like watching a biopic where half the scenes are invented and the ending is rewritten to make the studio happy. Audiences remember the film, not the person. That's how medieval women lived on. In stories edited by others, sometimes cruelly, sometimes flatteringly, rarely truthfully. The sensory weight of those lies still presses on us today. When we picture the medieval woman, we see caricatures: the silent nun, the tragic bride, the wicked witch, the noble queen. We rarely see the woman milking cows at dawn, laughing with friends, swearing at her children, or stealing an extra bite of bread at supper. Real life was vivid. Legend is flat. Historians wrestle with this legacy. Records contradict one another. Chronicles exaggerate plays. Moralized songs invent. Was a noble woman truly adulterous, or did enemies smear her name? Was a healer truly a witch, or simply a midwife whose remedies worked too well? Some accounts claim events happened yearly. Others don't mention them at all. The evidence is thin, the interpretations many. In the end, truth is frustratingly unclear. Yet within these legends lie fragments of resilience, even when twisted women's stories survived. Their names echo across centuries, carved into stone, sung in ballads, whispered in villages. And sometimes, hidden beneath the exaggerations, we glimpse their humanity, a saint's stubbornness, a queen's sharp tongue, a healer's compassion. The lies obscure, but they also preserve like dust settling over bones. You listening tonight might imagine sitting by a medieval fire as tales unfold. The storyteller leans forward, voice rising and falling, painting women as angels or demons. The crowd gasps, laughs, nods, and you realize none of them will know the truth. The woman herself is gone. All that remains is the story shifting with every telling, leaving her forever trapped in other people's words. This was the 20th disturbing fact. Legends and lies outlasted truth, rewriting women's lives to suit others' needs. And in that rewriting, women lost something more permanent than freedom. They lost their voices. As our journey closes, the candlelight dims. You've walked through veils and vows, dowries and debts, hunger and fear, baths and whispers, births and funerals. You've seen how every corner of medieval life pressed upon women, distorting their lives into survival. And yet, in every silence, in every shadow they endured. They sang, they worked, they loved, they defied, sometimes quietly, sometimes boldly. Their truth may be buried, but it still flickers like embers beneath ash. So tonight, as you drift to sleep, remember this history often tells us legends, but behind each legend was a woman who lived, breathed, suffered, and laughed. If you listen closely enough, you might still hear her.